tale of Aladdin. Now, if you look into this passage, you'll see for yourself that the basic debate is about the authorship of the tale of Aladdin. Has it been told by Antoine Galland, who was the first European translator of Arabian Nights, or it was someone else? Because they say that Antoine Galland, you see, he heard the story from a Syrian storyteller from Aleppo, and his name was Diab. The first paragraph talks about this. You see, you can find that in the first paragraph. And of course, the entire passage is a debate on that, a discussion on the authorship, whether what are the dates of this story? I mean, how did it first come? When did it first come to be listened, to be read? In the second paragraph, you will see that he says that there are fantastical elements, you see, elements which you cannot believe. Fantastical elements in literature are those elements, you see, which are just imaginative, invite your, what you call, disbelief. But the entire story, they say, some people say, you see, that the main character, you see, could be based on a real person's experiences. So now the debate is again, you see, touched upon in this paragraph. He says Galland, you see, he never credited Diab in his published translations of the Arabian stories. He never credited him, but Diab wrote something of his own. He had a travelogue, and in that travelogue, Diab says that he probably, you see, narrated the story of Aladdin to Galland and describes his own hard knocks upbringing and the way he marveled at the extravagance of Versailles. Now, the thing is, the descriptions you find in Diab, the same description you find in the version of Galland's story of Aladdin. I mean, so that somehow proves the point that Galland must have heard the story or read the story written by what you call Diab, narrated by Diab. So therefore, you see, he says Horta believes that Aladdin might be the young Arab Maronite from Aleppo, marveling at the jewels and riches of Versailles. So that is a comparative view, the second paragraph. Now, the third, you see, paragraph, again, he is back to the origins, you see, of the Aladdin story, that for 300 years, you see, scholars thought that the rags to riches story of Aladdin might have been inspired by the plots of French fairy tales. Quite possibly, it could have been, they say, an inspiration, you see, from the French fairy tales, or could be, you see, a byproduct of French Orientalism. But the thing is, but the point that he's making out here is the effect of what you call French Orientalism and what you call the exotic Middle Eastern luxuries that were prevalent then. The idea that Diab might have based it on his own life, the experiences of a Middle Eastern man encountering the French, not vice versa, flips the script. I mean, it would be something which would be the reverse of the argument that it was drawn from French Orientalism. But the moment you say, well, it was Diab, you see, who drew it from French Orientalism, or possibly French Orientalism drew it from Diab, that would be, you see, reversing the entire story. That is a debate that's going on here. And in the last paragraph, he says here, the scholars who study the tale, its narrative drama isn't the only reason storytellers keep finding reason to return to Aladdin. It reflects not only a history of the French in the Middle East, but also a story about Middle Easterners coming to Paris, and that speaks to our world today. So he is not talking about the historical importance of this story. It's not about a story about a man, simply, you see, Aladdin with all that magic. It's more or less, you see, a history of the French in the Middle East and the Middle Easterners coming to Paris, and that speaks to our world today. And the last few lines, he says, the day they told the story of Aladdin to Galland, there were riots due to food shortages during the winter and spring of such and such dates, and they was sensitive to those people in a way that Galland is not. When you read this diary, you see the solidarity among the Arabs who were in Paris at the time. There is little in the writings of Galland that would suggest that he was capable of developing a character like Aladdin with sympathy. This passage, in fact, you see, somehow supports the point that Diab could be the author, you see, could have been the author and not Galland, you see, because the way it is written, right? There is little in the writings of Galland that would suggest he was capable of developing a character like Aladdin with sympathy. But Diab's memoir reveals the narrator adept at capturing and so forth. So he gives the credit to Diab and not to what do you call this man, Galen. Now let's look at the questions now. All of the following serve as evidence of the character of Aladdin being based on Hana Diab, except number one, Diab's cosmopolitanism, number two, humble origins, and description of wealth of Versailles. The last one is an exception, Diab's narration of the original story to Galen. That doesn't serve, you see, as the evidence for the character of Allah. The next question now, he says the author of the passage is most likely to agree with which of the following explanations for the origins of the story of Aladdin. So that would be number three. Basing it on his own life experiences, Diab transmitted the story of Aladdin to Galen, who included it in the Arabian Nights. This has been already mentioned in the second paragraph also, a person's real life experience. So that is the correct answer, number three. So now we come to the next question. Which of the following, if true, would invalidate the version that the phrase flips the script refers to? Well, the version that flips the script referred to, if you go back to paragraph number 3, the last two lines, the idea that Diab might have based it on his own life, the experiences of a Middle Eastern man encountering the French, and not the other way around. It's not that the French possibly drew from him, but it's the Middle Eastern man encountering the French, not vice versa, reverses the script, that is, flips the script. Now the question is, which of the following, if true, would invalidate the inversion that the phrase flip the script refers to? The inversion that is referred to, then this statement, the description of opulence in Hannah Diab's and Antoine Galland's narratives bore no resemblance to each other. If you say they bear no resemblance to each other, then obviously you reverse the argument, because in the passage you can see for yourself there is a description, you see that there is some kind of resemblance, you see, in the description of the opulence, in the description of the wealth, you see, in the description of the plenty, right, in the lavishness. So number 3 is the correct answer. Now we come to the next question. Which of the following is the primary reason for why storytellers are still fascinated by the story of Aladdin? So an obvious reason is, number 1, the traveler's experience that inspired the tale of Aladdin resonates even today, right? It even echoes today, right? The traveler's experience. That is the primary reason that storytellers are still fascinated by the story of Aladdin. Now we come to the last question. Which of the following does not contribute to the passage's claim about the authorship of Aladdin? Does not contribute. Well, the narrative sensibility of Diab's travelogue, that contributes, because in the travelogue you have a certain mention of Aladdin. The depiction of the affluence of Versailles, that also contributes. Galland's acknowledgement of Diab in his diary, that too contributes. The storyline of many French fairy tales of the 18th century, they don't contribute the passage's claim about the authorship of Aladdin. The next passage is about choice fatigue. Choice fatigue is a kind of anxiety, is a kind of exhaustion, a tiredness, you see, where you're unable to decide what particular thing to purchase. Because if you have many brands, if you have got many varieties of a particular product, you see, then you start experiencing a kind of fatigue, a kind of tiredness, a kind of exhaustion, right? You're unable to decide what is to be bought. Now, that is a choice anxiety which he makes mention of in line number 1. And he says very clearly in that line that research has consistently held that people who are presented with a few options make better, easier decisions than those presented with many. That is the main point. Helping consumers figure out what to buy amid an endless sea of choice online has become a cottage industry unto itself. That's a separate industry. That's a separate, you see, business. It has become to train the customer, to teach the customer, to guide the customer what to buy and what not to buy. That has become a separate industry, leave alone what the customer wants to buy. But how to decide, how to make a choice, you see, that is a different industry that he's talking about. So choosing a product, you see, for many people has become a little difficult. You see, so many things matter, and he takes up all these things in the first paragraph. The advertisements, the way people are, you see, misled or led to go for a particular thing. They are tempted to a particular product, you see, with advertisements and other things, and the personal interest of the people, the gender of the customer, what you call the income level of the customer. So many things, you see, go into the world of buying and selling. These are certain things that he has taken up in the first paragraph. In the second paragraph, he's talking about in a narrower sense of what you call buying thing. And what he says here in the very first sentence, he says, for a relatively new class of consumer product startups, there's another method entirely. Instead of making a sea of existing stuff, these companies claim to disrupt stuff as Americans know it. There are certain companies, they give examples of Casper mattresses, Glossier makeup, you see, cosmetics and so forth, Away suitcases, and many others have sprouted to offer consumers freedom from choice. One product with all guarantee, possibly, which have a name, you see, those products. And why? Because the companies have a few aesthetically pleasing and supposedly highly functional options, usually at mid-range price. They offer you competitive price. They offer you things at prices you can afford, you see. They are selling nice things. And he says, but maybe more importantly, they are selling a confidence in those things and an ability to opt out of the stuff rat race, right? That rat race is you see, everybody is in the race, you see, to buy things. And they cut down on the choice fatigue with what you call prices that possibly the middle class customer can afford. Now, he gives an example. You see in the third paragraph, $1,000 mattresses at 3,000 suitcases might solve choice anxiety for a certain tier of consumer. That is a certain class of consumer. But the point is, would that be possible? You see, all the time, this kind of selling thing. You see, that is the point. As options have expanded for people with disposable income, the opportunity to buy even basic things such as fresh food or quality diapers has contracted for much of America's lower. Because he talks about in the first, second paragraph, he's talking about in general about consumers who can afford. But the point is, those who cannot afford, what about them? Even if the choice anxiety is reduced, when you talk about $1,000 mattresses and $300 suitcase, right? It might solve the choice anxiety for a certain tier of the consumer. But then the companies that sell them, you see, they are still working within a consumer market that's broken in systemic ways. What do you mean by broken in systemic ways? Systemic ways, that is broken inside. What do you mean by inside? That is within the system, right? That's the difference between systematic and systemic. That is the problem, you see, that comes up here, that they cannot cater to all classes of customers. And the last one, he says, for startups that promise accessible simplicity, their very structure still might eventually push them forward toward overwhelming variety. Most of these companies are based on hundreds of millions of dollars of venture capital, the investors of which tend to expect a steep growth rate that can't be achieved by selling one great mattress or one great sneaker. You see, they can't just limit themselves to these things. So therefore, when he talks about, you see, Casper mattresses. Now, when you say Casper mattresses, that means your choice is limited there. There's no choice anxiety. You're going for a particular brand. And you know, well, Casper sells mattress. But then we're given all this investment, you see, and the profits they have to earn, the companies will expand. They will include more and more goods and equipment and items. Casper has expanded into bedroom furniture and bed linens. Glossier, after years of marketing itself as a no makeup that requires little skill to apply, recently launched a full line of glittering color cosmetics. There may be no way to opt out of stuff by buying into the right thing. So the choice anxiety, you see, will keep on persisting. One company, you see, cannot just run their whole business on one product. Companies expand. Products, you see, are more and more products are produced. So you see, the choice anxiety cannot be narrowed down. Now let's come to questions here. Which of the following hypothetical statements would add the least depth? The least depth means would hardly contribute anything to the author's prediction of the fate of startups offering new product options. Number one, he says, an exponential surge in their sales enables startups to meet their desired profit goals without expanding their product catalog. That is the answer. Number one is the answer. And you have that answer, if you remember, in the last paragraph that we discussed. They try to offer more and more product without expanding their product catalog. So number one is the correct answer. The next one is, with the motive of promoting certain rival companies, the government decides to double the tax rate for these stars. Does he say anything of that kind in the passage? He doesn't. With Casper and Glossier venturing into new product ranges, their regular customers start losing trust in the companies and their products. No, that is incorrect. Startups with few product options are no exceptions to the American consumer market that is deeply divided along class lines. No, it doesn't add negatively to the author's prediction. Let's look at the next question. Which one of the following best sums up the overall purpose of the examples of Casper and Glossier in the passage? So just look at the options here. They are increasing the purchasing power of poor Americans. No, they aren't doing that. They are exceptions to a dominant trend in consumer markets. No. Why? Because later on he talks about their expansion into other products. They are facilitating a uniform distribution of commodities in the market. No. They might transform into what they were exceptions to. Yes, they weren't in a mood to manufacture, because Casper probably was manufacturing mattresses and Glossier was after cosmetic, specialized. But then later on, you see, they might transfer into something what they were exceptions to. So number four is the correct answer. The next one, a new food brand plans to launch a series of products in the American market. Which of the following product plans is most likely to be supported by the author of the passage? When you go through the entire passage, if you look at all his argument, then number one should be the correct answer. A range of 10 products priced between $5 and $10. Let's look at the next question. All of the following, if true, would weaken the author's claims except one statement, and that is the annual sales growth of companies with fewer product options were higher than that of companies which curated their products for target consumers. That is number two. Product options increase market competition, bringing down the prices of commodities, which in turn increase purchasing power of the poor. Is that it? Based on the passage. The next question, based on the passage, all of the following can be inferred about consumer behavior, except that the 1, 2, 3 can be inferred. Too many options have made it difficult for consumers to trust products. Consumers are susceptible to marketing images that they see on social media. Yes, that's correct. Having too many product options can be overwhelming for consumers. He talks about that. Consumers tend to prefer products by startups over those by established companies. I don't think you can infer this thing about the consumer behavior. So number four is the correct answer. Now let's come to the next passage. In this passage, he's talking about emperor penguins. And basically, he is talking about how penguins survive the daily chill, the cold, how they minimize heat loss by keeping the outer surface of their feathers, you see, plumage below the temperature of the surrounding air, right? And how the body insulates itself against the cold. That is the point he has raised in number one. And in number two, with all those details given about, you see, the degrees of Fahrenheit and so forth, the main thing he's talking about is the last line. The key to their trick is the difference between two types of heat transfer, radiation and convection. It is because of radiation and convection that the penguins are able to keep themselves warm. And then he explains in the third paragraph what is thermal radiation and what is thermal convection. Thermal radiation is the penguins, they lose internal body heat to the surrounding air, and the transfer of heat via the movement of a fluid, you see, that is thermal convection. He talks about both things in paragraph 3. And that is the reason why the penguins stay warm during their breeding season. In the last paragraph, he talks about most of this heat the researchers know probably doesn't make it all the way through the plumage and back to the penguins' bodies, but could make a slight difference. Again, he is talking about the heat radiation from the interior of the penguin. And point is, he's talking about how the penguins, you see, conserve calories and how they are able to go through this process of radiation and convection. So now we can come to the question. In the last sentence of paragraph 3, slightly warmer air and at a slightly colder temperature referred to and respective as the cold Antarctic air cycles around their bodies. Slightly warmer air comes into contact with the plumage and donate minute amounts of heat back to the penguins, then cycles away at a slightly colder temperature. The question wants to know what does this refer to, and the reference is in the last one, the cold Antarctic air whose temperature is higher than that of the plumage, and the fall in temperature of the Antarctic air after it has transmitted some heat to the plumage. That is the correct answer. So number 4 is the correct answer. The next question is, which of the following best explains the purpose of the word paradoxically as used by the author? What do you mean by a paradox? A paradox is a self-contradictory state. We look for a paradox in the 4 of these. Keeping their body colder helps penguins keep their plumage warmer. Number 1. Number 2, keeping a part of their body colder helps penguins keep their bodies warmer. And the heat gain through radiation happens despite the heat loss through convection. Heat loss through radiation happens despite the heat gain through convection. Number 3 and 4, they don't contain any paradoxes in that sense. You have a choice between 1 and 2, and number 2 is the correct answer, because it's not about keeping their whole bodies, you see, colder health. Keeping a part of their body cold helps penguin keep their bodies warm, right? That is a paradox, a self-contradictory statement, in the sense you feel that how can a part of body be colder in order to keep the entire body warm. Now we come to the next one. All of the following, if true, would negate the findings of the study reported in the passage except. The answer is the last one. The average temperature of the feet of the penguins in the month of 2008 were found to be 2.76 degrees Fahrenheit. Now, the question demands would negate the findings of the studies reported in the passage except. That means number 4 wouldn't negate. The other 3 would. The penguins' plumage were made of material that did not allow any heat transfers through convection or radiation. That's not a point that has been taken up there, right? Let's come to the next question. Which of the following can be responsible for emperor penguins losing body heat? Obviously, he is talking about the breeding season, so therefore it should be the reproduction process, right? And you can find that in the last paragraph. Let's come to the next passage, that is folk music. We have to be a little cautious in going through this passage. Free of the taint of manufacture, that phrase in particular is heavily loaded with the ideology of what the Victorian socialist William Morris called the anti-scrape or anti-capitalist conservationism, right? That solaces itself with the vision of a pre-industrial golden age. In Britain, folk may often appear a cozy fossilized form, but when you look more closely, the idea of folk, who has the right to sing it, dance it, invoke it, collect it, belong to it, or appropriate it for political or cultural ends, has always been a contested territory. And who has the right over that? What do you call folk? It is a contested territory. Now, in the second paragraph, he talks about the word folk, and he says, in our times, you see, it has achieved the rare distinction of occupying fashionable and unfashionable status simultaneously. What does he mean by fashionable and unfashionable? He's talking about being stylish and being humble. You see, that is the association with folk music. Just as the effusive floral prints of the radical William Morris now cover genteel sofas, so the revolutionary intentions of many folk historians and revivalists have led to music that is commonly regarded as parochial and conservative. Parochial means something which is restricted, something which is narrow, something which is limited. And yet, as the newspaper columns periodically rejoice, folk is hip again, influencing artists, clothing and furniture designers, celebrated at music festivals and so forth. Folk is a sonic shabby chic. containing elements of the uncanny and eerie as well as antique veneer, a whiff of Britain's southern dark ages. The very obscurity and anonymity of folk music origins often space up for rampant imaginative fancies. The point is glorifying the folk music. I mean, it is the way, it depends on which way we look at it. I mean, if you look at folk music as something you see simple, humble, parochial, limited, that is one way of looking at it. And the other thing is, according to folk music, you see, giving to folk music in a way that you treat it as something very obscure, something very interesting, something very strange, something very eerie, something which has gone back to the ages, you see, the heathen ages, paganism, when Christianity wasn't there. You try to associate folk music to that period, to that age. And then he comes to what you call the third paragraph, and he talks about Cecil Sharp, who wrote about this subject, believed that folk songs existed in constant transformation, a living example of an art form in a perpetual state of renewal. What he means to say is the folk music, folk songs, you see, they are what he called reviving all the time. They never get old. They are always new, right? One man sings a song and then others sing it after him. Changing what they do not like is the most concise summary of his conclusions to its origins. You see, it's like a ballad, BALLAD ballad. You see, ballads were poem songs that were handed down to generations. So folk songs, you see, what he says is it's in a state of perpetual renewal, what he called renewal. Why? Because when it is handed down from generation to generation, they make changes in the lyrics and the music. He compared each rendition of a ballad to an acorn falling from an oak tree. Every subsequent iteration shows the song anew. Just as from an oak tree, you have an acorn falling down, a seed coming down, and a new tree you see grows up, a new plant sprouts up. In the same way, when this is handed over to someone else down the generation line, you see something new comes out of, you see, the folk song. It doesn't remain all the same. But there is tension in newness. And what is the tension? In the late 1960s, purists were suspicious of folk songs recast in rock idiom. Electrification, however, comes in many forms. For the early 20th century composers such as Vaughan, Williams, and Holmes, there were thunderbolts of inspiration from Oriental mysticism, angular modernism, and the body blow of the First World War, as well as input from the rediscovered folk tradition itself. What's the tension in newness? Well, you talk about folk songs. Folk songs, you see, always keep on incorporating something new because they're handed down from generation to generation, right? And that is why he says here that they are inspired, you see, from Oriental mysticism. The Oriental mysticism refers to what he calls the mysticism that is practiced or prevalent in the East, the Eastern countries. For India, it's a country of Oriental mysticism. And then you have modernism. And then you have the World War. So you get all these things. And the body blow of the First World War, as well as input from the rediscovered folk tradition itself. For the second wave of the folk revivalists, such as Evan McCall and L. Lloyd, starting in the 40s, the vital spark was communism's dream of a post-revolutionary New Jerusalem. Now, see, could that be the subject matter for a folk song? For the younger successors in the 60s who thronged the folk clubs set up by the old guard, the lyrical freedom of Dylan and the unchained melodies of psychedelia created the conditions for folk rock's own golden age. So that is how the changes go on. Look at the 1940s. The 1940s was the talk of communism, the post-revolutionary New Jerusalem, the folk song, the subject matter of the folk song. But in the 60s, it was different, the subject matter. They had the lyrical freedom of Dylan and the unchained melodies of psychedelia, right? The psychedelic prints, you see, the psychedelic approach. Folk, rock, old, golden age. So rock music, you see, combined with folk music. A brief Indian summer that lasted from 69 to 71. 4 decades on, even that progressive period has become just one more era ripe for fashionable emulation and pastic. The idea of a folk tradition being exclusively confined to oral transmission, it's handed down, it's sung from one generation to another, has become a much looser, less severely guarded concept because people can incorporate whatever they want into it. Recorded music and television for today's metropolitan generation are where the equivalent of folk memories are seated. So that is what you call with all this recorded music and television for the present generation, you could find the equivalent of folk music there. He is trying to tell us that folk music can incorporate within itself, you see, new things depending on the age, depending on the times. Folk music is not something like recorded music and television, that it's going to just play what has been recorded. It has come down to us through oral transmission. And just as a ballad, you see, can be sung with newer things added to it, in the same way, you see, folk songs could be sung with newer things added to it and older things removed. That is the point he's trying to make. And now let's come to the questions here. The author says that folk may often appear a cozy, fossilized form because fossilized takes you back to the past. So, therefore, the answer should be number one, of its nostalgic association with the pre-industrial past. If it has been arrogated for various political and cultural purposes, that isn't the answer, you see. Folk is a sonic, shabby chick with an antique veneer. No, that is incorrect. The notion of folk has led to several debates and disagreements. Yeah, these points may be mentioned in the passage, but they don't answer the question, you see. The next question, all of the following are causes for plurality and diversity within the British folk tradition, except the fluidity of folk forms owing to their history of oral mode of transmission. We discussed that. That's correct, right? Number three, British folk forms can be traced to the remote past. That's correct. That British folk continues to have traces of pagan influence. Yes. But number two cannot stand. You see, paradoxically, folk forms are both popular and unpopular. So number two is the answer. The next question, at a conference on folk forms, the author of the passage is least likely to agree. He wouldn't agree with which one of the following views? Number three, folk forms in their ability to constantly adapt to the changing world exhibit an unusual poise and homogeneity with each change. The author wouldn't agree. He doesn't talk about the unusual poise and homogeneity. Yes, he talks about the uncanniness. He talks about what you call the eeriness. He talks about what you call the spark you see in those things, right? The power of the folk resides in its contrary ability to influence and be influenced by the present. That's correct. Number two, folk forms, despite their archaic origins, remain intellectually relevant in contemporary times. Yes, the writer would agree with these things. Yeah, in fact, he has stated these things. The plurality and democratizing impulse of folk forms emanate from the improvisation that its practitioners bring to it. That's the thing. You see, the diversity, the plurality, the causes that you look for, you can see that the practitioners, you see, it's handed down through oral transmission. So, number three is the answer. The next question, he says the primary purpose of the reference to William Morris and his floral prints is to show what? Answer is number two, that what is once regarded as radical and folk can later be seen as conformist. It shows that what is once regarded as radical in folk can later be seen as conformist. That is what you see as revolting, what you see as fundamentalist in getting to accept that thing. That is what he's saying here. The pervasive influence of folk on contemporary art, culture, and fashion. No, he's not talking about that. That what was once derided as genteel is now considered revolutionary. No, in fact, it wasn't derided as genteel, you see, or it's not being considered as revolutionary. That despite its archaic origins, folk continues to remain a popular tradition. It's not the point to be debated, you see. You say it might be and have an archaic origin, but the point is, it is in the ballad tradition, you see. So the number four cannot be the answer. Now let's come to the last question. Which of the following statements about folk revivalism of the 1940s and 60s cannot be inferred from the passage? Number one, freedom and rebellion were popular themes during the second wave of folk revivalism. That's correct. Number three is also correct. Even though it led to folk rock's golden age, it wasn't entirely free from the critique. It reinforced social sharp's observation about folks' constant transformation. The point is number two, electrification of music would not have happened without the influence of rock music. This point cannot be inferred, you see, from the above argument. If you look at the third paragraph, electrification, however, comes in many forms. And then he talks about the modernism and all those things. So, but this is not a point that can be inferred, you see, from the passage. In this passage, he is talking about topophilia means you have a feeling, a bond, an emotional bond with a particular place, which might even possibly bring in nostalgia, you see. For instance, you may be attached to your house in which you live or to a place where you have grown up. That kind of a feeling, the affective bond that you have, the emotional bond that you have with a particular place is known as topophilia. Now here in the first paragraph, he talks about what topophilia is. Topophilia, he says in the first line, as defined by the geographer Yi Fu Tun, is the affective bond between people and place. All of us have this kind of bond where we are brought up or where we are born, where we are educated. We might have a particular affiliation, a particular what you call attraction, you see, to that for that place. That is topophilia. Now the point is there are many factors influencing one's depth of response to the environment. You see, to the environment include cultural background, gender, race, historical circumstances, and so forth. He says that topophilia may not be the strongest of human emotions. Indeed, many feel utterly indifferent toward the environment. But the point is, what he's trying to tell us is giving us the two sides of the coin. He says that people may be attached to a particular place for reasons, you see, of birth, for reasons of any reason you're attached to a particular place you have stayed. Or sometimes people may be indifferent to a place, you see, in which they grow up, in which they are educated, in which they are born. They may be in. So several factors, you see, go into what you call the liking or the disliking or being indifferent to a place. Sometimes your affective bond with a particular place is so intense that it starts assuming symbolic proportions. That is, it becomes a symbol for you. In the second paragraph, he talks about aesthetic appreciation. He says there are three ways to respond to environment. How do we respond to our environment? Because environment, you see, engulf places also. When you talk about the environment, you are talking about places. So he says there are three ways you respond to an environment, and that is within the ambit of topophilia. You might have an aesthetic appreciation. Number one, how you react. Number one, how you respond. Number one, you might have an aesthetic appreciation. You might appreciate, you see, the rainbows that you saw in a particular place, the rainfall you had in a particular place, or the beauty of the landscape, and so many other things that you saw in a particular place, right? So you express your aesthetic appreciation. But that is one way of responding. The second way of responding is through acquired taste. Now, what do you mean by acquired taste? That is, you already live in a place. You live in a place, you go to a place, you are used to that place, and somehow you develop a kind of affiliation and attraction for them. That is an acquired taste. That is the second way to respond. And the last way to respond, he says, is maybe tactile and olfactory. That is by touch. And olfactory means by smell, namely a delight in the feel and smell of the air, water, and the earth. That is, you immediately recollect. You see, a symbolic process is activated. A particular smell, a particular touch reminds you of a particular place, right? You immediately say, well, I was in Shimla, I was in Delhi, I was in Bombay, or whatever it is. Or it could be even your house, your village. You say, well, this smell reminds me of my village, this touch reminds me of my village, of my place. So there are three ways to respond to the environment. In the third paragraph, he tells you that topophilia is an experience that, however elusive, has inspired recent architects and planners. It is an experience which may be elusive. You may not pay attention to it. It might be slipping your mind, slipping your feel, but then it has inspired architects and planners. So most notably, new suburbanism seeks to counter the perceived placelessness of modern suburbs and the decline of central cities through neo-traditional design motives. So they are designing new kinds of buildings, you see. You can see them for yourselves. You talk about apartments, buildings where they say, well, you have the feel of village there, or you have restaurants restaurants, hotels, which tell you, well, you will have the entire feel of your village. When you go to dine there, it will appear that you are in your own village. And they do that only because people are in love with particular places, but they may not be in a position to go back to those places. So what these architects and designers do, they create meaningful places for you. And then in the last two lines, he talks about a self-reflective philosophers such as H.D. Thoreau, Henry David Thoreau, evoking a marvelously intricate sense of place at Walden Pond. Right? Henry David Thoreau was a 19th century writer and poet in the United States of America. Right? He's a great figure in American literature. He's a transcendentalist. And he has written a book, you see, Walden Pond, where he recollects so many things. And that is why it gets mentioned here. Okay, now the last paragraph, he talks about, say, connotes a positive relationship, but it often is useful to explore the darker affiliations between people and peers. Sometimes topophilia might also indicate a kind of fanaticism. You are freaked out. You are fanatic about a place, and that is the darker affiliation, the darker. The lighter side he has already talked about. You have an affective bond with them. You remember those places. You are emotionally attached. But then topophilia, love of a place, love of a country might sometimes reach to the level of fanaticism. And he gives an example. He says patriotism, literally meaning the love of one's terra patria or homeland, has long been cultivated by governing elites for a range of nationalist projects, including war preparation and ethnic cleansing. You can just imagine what's happening in the entire world. It was a kind of a blind topophilia of Hitler, you see, in Germany, when he started, you see, exterminating the Jews. And he said only Germany is for only Aryans, right? Now, that kind of a love of your motherland, well, that is also topophilia. But then one branch of topophilia is patriotism, dark patriotism, where you won't allow other people to live in your country. You throw them out. Hitler did that in Germany. And this kind of ethnic cleansing is happening now and then somewhere in the world. Some countries practice that, unfortunately. So that is the darker side of topophilia. Residents of upscale residential developments have disclosed how important it is to maintain their community distinct identity, often by casting themselves in superior social position by reinforcing class and racial difference. Look, what is that topophilia? You're living at a place. Say you're living at Bunny Park or you're living at Raja Park or some other place, for instance. Now they have created an elitist society. They don't want anybody else to enter that place. Now such kind of topophilia creates class difference. They don't allow other people to enter that particular colony. By enter means that is they don't want others to come and purchase houses there. They have created, you see, housing societies and all these cute of what you call skyscrapers all over the world, all over the country, all over the place. And there they have what you call class distinction, the rich, the poor. So topophilia might lead to that kind of feeling also. And just as a beloved landscape is suddenly relieved, so too many landscapes of fear cast a dark shadow over a place that makes one feel a sense of dread or anxiety or topophobia, right? Now, look how well he argues from topophilia. So long topophilia has to do with aesthetic appreciation, so long it has to do with your affective bond to a place, so long it has to do with your touch, with your smell, so long you have to do with your nostalgia, your affection for a particular place, your tying to a particular place, topophilia is fine. But the moment topophilia, you see, assumes darker proportions, you see, like dark patriotism, or you see, like it engenders racial differences, then what happens is it's not anymore topophilia, it is topophobia. It has created fear in the minds of the people. Well, such and such place, you see, is a place of that creates anxiety, that creates dread, that creates fear, right? So that is all about this passage. Now we can come to the question. The word topophobia in the passage is used. We just concluded on that. And it is used to represent a feeling of dread towards particular spaces and places. Number one is the correct answer. Let's look at the next question. In the last paragraph, the author uses the example of residents of upscale residential developments to illustrate what? I just told you before we finished. That is, such things, you see, create classes, you see. So the answer should be number 4. Social exclusivism practiced by such residents in order to enforce a sense of racial or class superiority. They don't allow others to come and live there. The prices are high. They belong to a different caste, different community. That is the reason. And the number one, introduction of nationalist projects by such elites to produce a sense of dread or topophobia. No, it doesn't illustrate that. Manner in which environments are designed to minimize the social exclusion of their clientele. This point is not anywhere taken up in the passage. Sensitive response to race and class problems in upscale residential development. No, he's not talking about the sensitive response. He's actually talking about the social exclusivist attitude. So number 4 is the correct answer. Now let us take up the next question. Which one of the following best captures the meaning of the statement topophilia is difficult to design for and impossible to quantify? Yes, that feeling, you see, that topophilia, you see that feeling, that affective bond, he said that is very difficult to design and very difficult to quantify also. You can't possibly describe the degree of your affective bond to a place. So which one of the following statements best captures this meaning? Philosophers, architects are uniquely suited to develop topophilic design. No, it's not that. I mean, it doesn't talk about philosophers, right? People's responses to their environment are usually subjective, and so cannot be rendered in design. That's what I told you. That is, your affective bond cannot be quantified. Your feelings cannot be quantified, or possibly you see desire, you see put in shape. So therefore, this is the correct answer. Architects have to objectively quantify spaces and hence cannot be topophilic. It doesn't say that. In fact, architects are working in a way that your aesthetic appreciation, you see, is elicited so that you feel that you are at a place you are missing. Enemy of modern urbanization led to new urbanism's intricate sense of place. Well, that is incorrect. That's not the correct thing. The next question, which one of the following comes closest in meaning to the author's understanding of topophilia? The French are not overly patriotic, but they will refuse to use English as far as possible, even when they know it well. It cannot be. Number 2, the tendency of many cultures to represent their land as motherland or fatherland may be seen as an expression of their topophilia. Yeah, that could be a correct thing because he has already talked about that. When he talks about ethnic cleansing and racial differences, why do these things happen? Because of the darker side. When you start treating, you see, your country as motherland, fatherland, and then you start adding, you see, the darker side of patriotism. Number 2 is the answer. Scientists have found that most creatures, including humans, are either born with or cultivate a strong sense of topography. Now, this hasn't been mentioned in passage, and even if it's not mentioned, if we have to choose from here, we won't choose that because it isn't in any way closest in meaning to the author's idea of topophilia, right? Nomadic societies are known to have the least affinity for the land through which they traverse because they tend to be topophobic. That's a point out of range, you see, of this passage. The next question you have here is, which of the following statements, if true, could be seen as not contradicting the arguments in the passage? That is, they are in agreement with what the passage says. Generally speaking, in a given culture, the ties of the people to their environment vary little in significance or intent. This doesn't appear to be the answer. Number 2, patriotism, usually seen as a positive feeling, is presented by the author as a darker form of topo. Yes, that is the answer. Number 2 is the answer. New urbanism succeeded in those designs where architects collaborated with their client. No, that is incorrect. The most important, even fundamental response to our environment is our tactile and olfactory response. No, that is only one of the responses, tactile and olfactory. It's not the fundamental. This cannot be the answer. Now let's proceed. Let us look at this. People with dyslexia have difficulty with print reading, and people with autism spectrum disorder have difficulty with mind. Okay, he's talking about two things. And then you have an example of a lost cognitive instinct. It is mind reading, our capacity to think of ourselves and others as having beliefs, desires, thoughts, and feelings. And then it says mind reading looks increasingly like literacy. He explains mind reading there and then he explains print reading. Now the point is we have to make a choice. We can't have 3 and 4 as the first sentences because they are supposed to be, they are explaining something which have already been stated. So you have to make a choice between 1 and now if you make a choice between 1 and 2, then you take number 2 as the first, because 2 is giving you an example of a lost cognitive instinct. It explains the lost cognitive instinct is mind reading, our capacity to think of ourselves and others as having beliefs, desires, thoughts, and okay. Now in number 3 explains what mind reading is. So 3 should follow, and 4 he explains what print reading is. So we have 2, 3, 4. And then the final, people with dyslexia have difficulty with print reading, and those you see with mind reading. So the answer is 2, 3, 4, 1. Now we come to the next question. If you have seen a little line of text on websites that says something like customers who bought this also enjoyed that, you have experienced this collaborative filtering firsthand. This collaborative, since you have this collaborative filtering, this cannot be the first set. It has to have a reference point. He must have already said something somewhere about collaborative filtering, and he says that in number 4. So therefore number 4 should be the first. Collaborative filtering is a mathematical algorithm. Number 1, the first sentence should be 4. After 4 you can have number 1, because there he explains you have experienced this collaborative feeling. You see, now you have a reference point. In 4 you have collaborative filtering, and in 1 you have this collaborative filter. Okay, now see what he says here. The problem with these algorithms is that they don't like to take into account a host of nuances and circumstances that might interfere with their accuracy. After what you call the collaborative filtering, in this context, you can see when he's talking about in 4 about the mathematical algorithm, you can see for yourself in number 2, he's talking about number 1. First he talks about the collaborative filtering, then he talks about what he call the problem with these algorithms. So it should be 4, 1, and then after that 2, the algorithm that has already been stated. And the last sentence is of course number 3, if you just bought a gardening book for your cousin and so forth. Now let's come to the next cluster of sentences. We'll all live under mob rule until then. Now until then is when, so that cannot be the first sentence. I mean, something has to happen. That is what he means. Perhaps we need to learn to condense the feedback we receive online so that 100 replies carry the same weight as just. Now, perhaps we need to learn. There must have been something, he must have been talking about some kind of learning in some sentence, and that he does in number 3. As we grow more comfortable with social media, conversations being part of the way we interact every day, we are going to have to learn how to deal with legitimate criticism. So number 3 should be the first set. After 3, you should have number 2. We need to learn to condense the feedback. And then after number 2, you have number 4. A new norm will arise where it is considered unacceptable to reply with the same point that dozens of others have already done. You see, a new norm will arise. So then one can logically follow, you see, number 4, because he says a new norm will arise. We'll all live under mob rule until then, right? Yeah. So 3, 2, 4, 1. Now we come to the next cluster. Metaphors may map to similar meanings. Similar meanings across language, right? But their subtle differences can have a profound effect on our understanding of the word. So we have may map to similar meanings. Now there must be something he must have said somewhere about meanings and their similarity. So we have number 1 as the first sentence. Okay. Latin scholars point out carpe diem. Carpe diem means to seize the day. Is a horticultural metaphor that, particularly seen in the context of its source, is more accurately translated as plucking the day, evoking the plucking and gathering of ripening fruits or flowers, enjoying a moment that is rooted in the sensory experience of nature, unrelated to the force implied in seizing. Now, that's one interpretation. You see, he says Latin scholars have pointed out. Now, number 4, it says it's an example. We don't know what is an example. What example is it talking? So, in the given context, first of all, we have in number 3 a general idea You see what the phrase carpe diem is. And then we go to what the Latin scholars say about carpe diem. So the first sentence should be number 3. The phrase carpe diem, which is often translated as seize the day, and its accompanying philosophy has gone on to inspire countless people in how they live their lives and motivates us to see the world a little different from them. That is the general meaning. But then the horticultural culturists, you see, they have a different meaning, you see, and Latin scholars have pointed it out. So after 3, we have 2. Now, it's an example of one of the more telling ways that we mistranslate metaphors from one language to another, revealing in the process our hidden assumptions about what we really value. Now, he says it's an example. The Latin scholars, you see, whatever they have done, it's an example of what you call a mistranslation of the metaphor, because people want to mean what they want it to mean. So it should be 3 and then 2 and then 4 and then finally. So now you can justify metaphors may map to similar meanings across language. The same metaphor, you see, could have different meanings or similar meaning, but their subtle differences can have a profound effect on our understanding of those. So the final answer is 3 to 4. Now let's come to the next question. Vance, Packard, the hidden persuaders alerted the public to the psychoanalytical techniques used by the advertising. Its premise was that advertising agencies were using depth interviews to identify hidden consumer motivation, which were then used to entice consumers to buy goods. So you understand what they're doing. They are using research, a psychoanalytic technique, you see, in order to attract the consumer, in order to bait the consumer, the hidden consumer motivation. Critics and reporters often wrongly assumed that Packard was writing mainly about subliminal advertising. Packard never mentioned the word subliminal, however, and devoted very little space to discussions of sub-threshold effects. Instead, his views largely aligned with the notion that individuals do not always have access to their conscious thoughts and can be persuaded by supraliminal messages without their knowledge. That is, you study the psychology of the customer, psychology of individuals, psychology of people, and you come up with a package, you come up with a psychoanalytical package, you come up with a package that affects the customers, the clients, you see, psychologically. Because those customers, consumers, possibly, just as you're not aware of your hidden talent, they may have some hidden taste or some hidden motivation. Now, out of the 4 of them, the best one is number 2. Packard held that advertising is a hidden persuasion, understands the hidden motivations of consumers. You how clearly stated, and works at the supraliminal level, though the people targeted had no awareness of being. He has said that in a simple way, in the best way possible. So the best answer is number 2. Let's move on to the next one. A distinguishing feature of language is the ability to refer to absent things known as displaced reference. That is one of the abilities of language. You could talk about things which are absent. A speaker can bring distant reference to mind in the absence of any obvious stimuli. That is, even if you don't have a stimuli, an inducement, you can always recall things that happened years and years ago. Thoughts not limited to the here and now can pop up into our heads for unfathomable. Human beings, you see, they have such a kind of brain, you see, that it's not only in the present they live. They can live in the past. They can recall the past. They think about the future, you see. They can do so many things with the brain. This ability to think about distant things necessarily precedes the ability to talk about them. Yes, what's he trying to point out is, that is, before talking, before speech, you see, it was thought. I mean, thought comes first and then speech. Thought precedes meaningful referential communication. A prerequisite for the emergence of human-like meaningful symbols is that the mental categories they relate to can be invoked even in the absence of immediate stimuli. You see, that in psychology is the symbolic process. The symbolic process is you look at a particular thing, and that particular thing symbolizes for you something which you can recall from the past. The symbolic process is activated, you see. The main point he makes is, that is, you can talk about things that are absent, number 1. Number 2, you can recall things in the past. It's not necessary that you have to talk about the present only. And number 3, it is thought which comes first and then speech. These are 3 important, right? Now let us look at the summary here. And he says thoughts precede all speech acts, and these thoughts pop up in our heads even in the absence of any stimulus. Now, that is trivializing the whole thing. I mean, you're saying that thoughts precede all speech acts, and these thoughts pop up in our heads even in the absence of any stimulus. That is, he has just simplified the whole thing. We can look for a better summary. You see, the ability to think about objects not present in our environment precedes the development of human communication. The ability to think, see, that is the main thing. So number two we have in mind, that is a better summary than number one. Thoughts are essential to communication, and only humans have the ability to think about objects not present in their surroundings. Now, we don't require two sentences to illustrate the whole thing. One sentence can do that very well, and therefore number two is correct. Displaced reference is particular to humans and thoughts pop into our heads for no real. You must have seen that these three sentences, 1, 3, and 4, you see, he's making use of A and the end to connect two things which are not properly arranged, you see. Number two is said in a very summary manner, in a succinct manner, in a concise manner, and it has been delivered well. So number two is the correct answer. Now let's move on to the next one. And in this, if you must have seen that he is talking about physics as a pure science, and which seeks to understand the behavior of matter without regard to whether it will afford any practical benefit. Now we have got engineering. Now engineering is the correlative applied science in which physical theories are put to specific use, such as building a bridge or a nuclear reactor. You see, possibly physics may teach you all these things, how to build a bridge and how to build a nuclear reactor. It might teach you these things, but it is the engineering, the task of engineering, you see, that has to go about building bridges and making nuclear. Engineers obviously rely heavily on the discovery of physicists. A physicist is the person who is a scholar of physics, or a scientist who has to do with physics. But an engineer's knowledge of the world is not the same as the physicist's knowledge. In fact, an engineer's know-how will often depend on physical theories that, from the point of view of pure physics, are right, because the engineer has to have a know-how, a knowledge, you see, on all the physical theories, and some of those physical theories, you see, from the point of view of pure physics may be false, but they may be of some use in engineering. There are some reasons for this. First, theories that are false in the purest and strictest sense are still sometimes very good approximations to the true one. The theories may apparently, you see, be false or appear false, but they are quite nearer to the real theory or the true theory, and often have the added virtue of being much easier to work with. Second, sometimes the true theories apply only under highly idealized conditions, which can only be created under controlled experimental situations. Right? Those two true theories, you see, they can be only work under idealized conditions. The engineer finds that in the real world, theories rejected by physicists yield more accurate predictions than the ones they accept. So let us look at the summary, you see. The first one, the unique task of the engineer is to identify, understand, and interpret the design constraints to produce a successful result. This doesn't say anything about physics or pure science, so number one cannot be the right summary. The relationship between pure and applied science is strictly linear, with the pure science directing applied science and never the other way around. Now, that is not the debate in question. That is not the point in question, the relationship between pure and applied science, whether it is linear or not, right? So, number two cannot be a good summary. Let us look at number three. Though engineering draws heavily from pure science, that we have seen, he mentions that. It contributes to knowledge, we also saw that, by incorporating the constraints and conditions in the real, which possibly a pure physics may not accommodate all these constraints. So number three is the best summary, and number four, engineering and physics fundamentally differ on matters like building a bridge or nuclear reactor. No, that is not the point. That is wrong. That is not the message in the passage. So number three is the correct. Now we move on to the next question. His idea to use sign language was not a completely new idea, as Native Americans used hand gestures to communicate with other tribes. Look at the key points here. Number one, sign language. Number two, hand gesture. Number two, ancient Greek philosopher Aristotle, for example, observed that men who are deaf are incapable of. Now, this is something has to do with the deaf and the dumb. Now let's look at number 3. People who were born deaf were denied the right to sign a will, as they were presumed to understand nothing, because it is not possible that they have been able to learn to read and or write. Now the point is, it's a question of communication. So we saw that the use sign language, hand gestures, reading and writing, the ability, the capability to sign something. So number 3, you see, perfectly gels with number 1. Pushback against this prejudice began in the 16th century when Pedro Ponce de Leon created a formal sign language. Again, you have the reference to the sign language which is mentioned in number 1 and in number 3. For a millennia, people with hearing impairments encountered marginalization because it was believed that language could only be learned by hearing. The point is 1, 3, 4, 5. It's talking about communication. It may talk about the deaf and dumb, but the more important thing, it's about communication. And therefore, number 2, you see, doesn't fit in well. Number 2 is the odd one out. Now, let's come to the next question. One argument is that actors do not fit within a single well-defined category may suffer an illegitimacy discount. Others believe that complex identities confuse audiences about an organization's role or purpose. In number 1, we don't have anything. Looking at the other 4 sentences, we don't have any keyword. You see, for instance, in number 2, you have the complex identities. In number 3, you have the complex and multi-dimensional identities that span or combine categories, while other organizations possess narrow identity. Number 4 talks about the identity as being one of the important features, right? And how identity affects organizational performance, right? And number 5 talks about, again, those complex identities are beneficial to the strategic disadvantages of ambiguity, and so the point is, number 1 doesn't talk about any kind of identity, right? And even if it talks about, it's not clear. So number 1 is the odd one out. Now let's look at the last question here. STAT stats signaled sometimes measurable, while MATIC advertised free labor, but Tron above all indicated control. The point is, the use of the word stat, MATIC, Tron, they are all suffixes added to what you call the main root word. For instance, you have thermostat, rheostat, you have matic, problematic, schematic, systematic, or you have TRON, Tron. So they are all suffix. He's talking about these suffixes. It was a totem of high modernism. The intellectual and cultural mode that decreed no process or phenomenon was too complex to be grasped, managed, and optimized. Now, in number 2, we don't know what we are talking about. You see, because it was a totem of high modernism. What was it? What is he talking about? High modernism, because in the first, he's talking about the suffixes. In the second, he doesn't talk about. Okay. Now he says here, like the heraldic shields of ancient knights, these morphemes were painted onto the names of scientific technology to proclaim one's history and achievements to friends and enemies alike. Yes, he may be talking about morpheme. Now, morpheme is supposed to be a minimal linguistic unit, you see, which has meaning, which cannot be subdivided further. For instance, you have the word dog, D-O-G, dog, or you have C-A-T, cat. Now, that is the minimal unit of a linguistic unit. It cannot be morphological. It cannot be divided further. That is a morpheme. Or, for instance, you have the word incoming. Now, in is one morpheme. That is a prefix. It cannot be subdivided. Or you have ing at the end, ing. It cannot be subdivided. They are all morphemes. So now you understand what he means to say. The historian Robert Proctor at Stanford University calls the suffix tron along with matic and stat embodied symbol. To gain the suffix was to acquire a proud and optimistic emblem of electronic and atomic age. So in electronic, you have tron. Now the point is here is, in 1, 3, 4, 5, everything is about the morpheme, the suffix, but number 2, you see, does not give any clue. So number 2 is the odd one out.